right, I believe it is time for us to begin tonight. We are ready for the exciting conclusion of the book of 1 Samuel. Chapters 30 and 31, I've entitled this Restoration and Ruin. As again, in these two chapters, we have a contrast between David and Saul. David, if you remember, had been a mercenary for one of the Philistine kings from Gath. And he decided that David and his men needed to go with him in fighting against Israel. And so, how's he going to get out of that? Well, the rest of the Philistine kings did not want him there, afraid that he would turn on them and it would end up like it had done earlier in the book. And so he is sent back to Ziklag. And chapter 30 finds him going back and finding the city of Ziklag having been attacked by the Amalekites. It was burned, and all of the people and all of the livestock had been taken. His response to that in chapter 30. Chapter 31, we turn our attention back to Mount Gilboa. Let me go ahead and put the map up. I don't know how easily you can see this, but right here is Mount Gilboa. Kind of put that in place. Right down here is Bethlehem. This is Ziklag, where David had been living. You remember Saul went to Endor. There it is right there, so it's just south of there. That's where Saul, and when we get into chapter 31, the battle is already raging. It's been going on for a while, and Israel is being defeated. Chapter 31 records Jonathan and Saul's other sons being killed, Saul himself wounded mortally. He calls for his armor bearer to kill him so that the Philistines would not be able to find him and torture him, execute him. The armor bearer refused to do so, so Saul takes his own life. Some other things happen there in chapter 30. That's the basic idea of what we're looking at. So you have David rising through crisis while Saul falls in battle. Let's go ahead and kind of look at each chapter separately. Chapter 30, David is overwhelmed. Now, when he gets back to Ziklag, he finds the city burned. Nobody is there. His wives, his family, the family of all of his men have been kidnapped. Anything of value has been taken. And verse 4, David and the people with him lifted up their voices and wept until they had no more power to weep. This incident would be bad enough if it's the only thing that happened. But think back to what has been going on in David's life. You go all the way back, chapter 18 or so, and you have Saul relentlessly pursuing David, trying to kill him over and over again. And you have the incident with Nabal, where David just about does something he should not do. You have Saul after him again. He flees to the Philistines. He ends up getting himself in a mess where he is about to go and fight against his own people. And now this happens. And so sometimes you can be overwhelmed. Have you ever Have you ever said about something, about a terrible situation, how much worse can it get? And then it gets worse. And that's kind of where David is. I mean, how much worse can it get? And they get a reprieve. So they're going back to Ziklag. We got out of that situation, and then he finds this. Now, in your mind, he doesn't know the condition of the people that were taken. He doesn't know that nobody's been injured, nobody's been hurt. You could imagine him thinking, family's gone. Not just his, but 600 men with him, and all of those families gone. And so there's a statement made in verse number 6 that is significant. And David was greatly distressed. The people spoke of stoning him, because the soul of all the people was grieved, every man for his sons and his daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. And so, first of all, they talked of stoning him. David, this is your fault. If you had not taken us into the Philistines' land, if you had not put us in this situation, this wouldn't happen. And so they were going to stone him. And David turns himself to God and strengthens himself there. Let me go ahead and put up, I've got 4 thoughts for this chapter. Let me just go ahead and put all 4 of them up. God's strength is sufficient when God's servant is overwhelmed. His providence is essential. His grace is decisive, and his victory is encouraging. Whenever you find yourself overwhelmed, as David obviously was, these things are true, and these things we can find the strength that is needed. His strength is sufficient. Here is David at his lowest point, and the city is destroyed, his family's gone, they weep till they have no strength. He is about himself to be stoned. And he turns and finds strength in the Lord. Now I want you to notice 3 things about that. First of all, David strengthened himself in the Lord, his God. There is a personal connection between David and God. Now, look at a couple of passages in Psalms. Psalm 80 and verse number 1. Give ear, O shepherd of Israel, you who lead Joseph like a flock. The shepherd of Israel. That's God, right? God is the shepherd of Israel. But what did David say in Psalm 23? The Lord is my shepherd. There is a difference between God being the shepherd of Israel and the Lord being my shepherd. He's both. But he can be the shepherd of Israel without being my shepherd if I'm not careful. And with David, this is the Lord his God. And he can find strength in God because he has that connection with him. Secondly, he can find strength in God's promise. What is it that God had made clear to David, even through the words of Saul himself? Jonathan had encouraged David with this as well. You will be king. Whatever's going on, David knew God had said, you will be king. Do we have promises from God today? Are they certain? Are they clear? No matter what's going on, what God has promised is true and will be. And so we can find strength in that. And then thirdly, look at verses 7 and 8. What David does after this, he goes to Abiathar the priest, This is the one priest that was spared when Saul wiped out the priesthood at Nob. And he says to Abiathar, bring the ephod to me. And he brought it, so that David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I pursue this troop? Shall I overtake them? And the Lord said, pursue, and you'll surely overtake them, without fail recover all. So you have the personal connection between David and his God. You have God's promise that David could find comfort in. And finally, you have God's presence. David seeks direction from God. Can we seek direction from God today? Do you have the ephod that Abiathar brought to him? You have access to that? No, we don't have that. We have something far, far better than that. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 14, also chapter 2 speaks of Jesus as our great high priest. When is he available to us? Always, without fail. When I'm in trouble, he's there. When I have been blessed, he's there. It matters not what the circumstances are, he is always there, and whatever it is I need, he has promised I can receive it from him. And so those things David is able to find strength in the Lord. He's at rock bottom, but he knows where to turn. Saul had been there at times, in trouble, in need, but he didn't know where to turn. He turned to himself, and he went to his physical strength or someone that he could put trust in. He did not turn to God. And so when we have that need, we need to recognize we can be strengthened in the Lord our God. Now, there's something else about that. I mentioned it earlier. You've been there where, how much worse could it get? And then it gets worse. That's what you're seeing here. God is upfront about those kind of troubles. He doesn't hide that. He doesn't sugarcoat it. He doesn't try to make it like, oh, there's never any problems. You know, David is God's anointed and David is God's chosen, so he has no problems. That's not what you see in Scripture at all. Over and over again, God is very transparent when it comes to the fact that God's people can and will suffer. The night that he was betrayed, as Jesus spoke to his apostles, John chapter 16, he said, in the world you will have tribulation. Was that the case? Is that what happened? With the exception of one. Every one of those men, if history is correct, every one of those men died a martyr's death for that Lord who was telling them, in the world you'll have tribulation. That one exemption was John, who apparently died of old age. But he suffered. He was exiled, and he suffered tribulation for him. He never hid that from them. He never suggested, just follow me and you'll have no problems at all. But he followed that up with some other words. He said, in the world you have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. And so his strength is sufficient for us. Whatever it is we face, whatever it is we must do, his strength is sufficient. Secondly, his providence is essential. When you get back into it, God had told him, pursue and you'll overtake them and you'll recover them without fail. And so here's another promise that God has given that David can trust. You're going to recover everything, and there won't be nothing left. So verse 9, he and the 600 men left out, but 200 of them stayed behind because they were so weary they could not cross the brook Besor. So now they've divided up. 200 stay behind, 400 go with David. And as they are going, they come across an Egyptian. Verse 11, he's in a field. And David gave him bread, and he ate, water to drink. They gave him a cake of figs and 2 clusters of raisins. And when he had eaten, his strength came back to him, because he had not eaten or drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. Then David said to him, "To whom do you belong, and where are you from?" Yeah. What's your name? Who's your people? Do you notice something there? Now, if you've read ahead, you know that David gets some really, really good intelligence from this man, because he had been a servant of one of those Amalekites who had destroyed Ziklag and kidnapped the people. David didn't know this at that time. And so when he asked him, he said, "I am a young man from Egypt. I was a servant of an Amalekite. My master left me behind because 3 days ago I fell sick." So, you have things in your house that are disposable. When you use them up, you throw them away. That's what he did. The Amalekite used up this Egyptian servant when he was sick. He throws him away. So he said, "We made an invasion of the southern area of the Cherethites, and the territory belonged to Judah, and the southern area of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag with fire." And David said, "Can you take me to this troop?" He gets David to promise that he would not punish him nor turn him back over to his Amalekite master, which David agrees to. Now, before we go any further, David fed this man, gave him water, before he knew that he would get anything of interest or importance from him. It was David's kindness that fed him and cared for him, and that then enables him to get what he needs from this man. But notice how important a discarded Egyptian slave is. How important was he to that Amalekite master? Not at all. He's disposable. You can throw him away. In fact, he's more trouble than he's worth. Because he's sick, we'd have to care for him. Let's just cut our losses and get rid of him. But look at how important this man is to David and the soldiers that are with him. Because it is because of him they find the Amalekites that did that and are able to recover their people. Here again is an incident of God's quiet providence. There's not a thing there that says God did this. There's not a thing that says his hand was involved in bringing this man before David, but you can see that he did, can't you? It's obvious that God did this. It's obvious that he was involved in this. And so David, verse 16, verse 15, the man said, "I'll take you down to this troop." So when they brought him down, they were spread out all over the land, eating and drinking and dancing, because of the great spoil which they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from the land of Judah. Why were they so exposed that they had no watch? They didn't have anything to protect them from somebody like David coming upon them. There's no need to. Where's David in their minds? He's with the Philistine army. Way up north, remember from the map, way up north fighting against Saul. There's nobody around. So we can enjoy the spoils, and that didn't work out too well for them. So verse 17, David attacked them from twilight until the evening the next day. Not a man of them escaped except 400 young men who rode on camels and fled. So David recovered all that the Amalekites had carried away. And David rescued his 2 wives. Verse 19, nothing of theirs was lacking, either small or great, sons or daughters, spoil or anything which they had taken from them. David recovered all. And then verse 20, David took all the flocks and herds that had been driven before those other livestock and said, "This is David's spoil." So he exerted his authority to say, "This belongs to me." But notice what he does with it at the end of the chapter. Keep that in mind when we get there. But here is, again, this is not luck. This is not military prowess. This is God's providence providing for David. He guided him, he provided for him, and he restored those things that had been taken. So, we need to be reminded in our own lives. God's strength is sufficient for us if we'll put our trust in Him. And His providence is essential in our lives. And you don't know at the time that it's God's providence. One of the best articles I've ever read on the subject of providence was written by Wayne Jackson back many, many, many years ago. And you can probably find that on the Christian Courier website. But one of the things he said in that article was that providence is both knowable and unknowable. And then he explained, it is knowable because the Bible teaches that God does that God acts providentially on the part of His people. Here's an example of it. We looked at other passages like Romans 8 verse 28 and other passages like that tell us that God cares providentially for His people. It is knowable. At the same time, it is unknowable. Because at any instance in my life, me knowing that God works providentially for His people, or that all things work together for good to those that love God and are called according to His purpose, Romans 8:28. I can't look at anything that's going on and say, that's God doing it. Because I don't know that. And a good illustration of that is in the book of Philemon. Now I think it's verse 15, where Paul, in writing to Philemon, you remember what had happened? Onesimus was a slave, and for some reason he runs away from Philemon, and he ends up in the city of Rome, and he comes into contact with Paul, and Paul is able to speak to him the gospel, and he is converted to Christ. So that now Onesimus is a Christian. So he writes to Philemon, and the letter that he's writing to Philemon, he's going to send with Onesimus, and send Onesimus back to Philemon. And in that, Paul says, perhaps he left you for a while that you might receive him forever. Not as a servant, but as a brother. The key word there is Paul said, perhaps. Paul said, this may be God's providence. I don't know that, but it may be God's providence. And if Paul, an apostle of Jesus, an inspired apostle of Jesus, had to say, I don't know if this incident is God's providence or not, it could be. And I think that's the only way you and I can approach it. And things happen in our lives, and things work out differently than we thought they would, and it ends up being something that is good and worthwhile. And we could say perhaps that's God's providence. And at the same time, knowing that God has and will continue to work in our lives in a providential way. So, His providence is essential. It's essential in David's life, and I think we need to recognize the same in our own. Let me stop right there. We've got two more thoughts there in this chapter. Anything you want to add to that, or question, or any thought? All right, let's move on to the third one. God's grace is decisive. When they get back to the men who could not cross the river because they were exhausted. Some of those men who had gone with David said, these men don't deserve any of the spoil. They didn't go with us, so they shouldn't get anything. And David said, you're not going to do that. Verse 21 and 22 is when they say they can take their family, and that's really all they ought to get. But David said, my brethren, you shall not do so with what the Lord has given us, who has preserved us and delivered into our hand the troop that came against us. For who will heed you in this matter? But as his part is who goes down to the battle, so shall his part be who stays by the supplies, and they shall share alike. So it was from that day forward. He made it a statute and an ordinance for Israel to this day. So David said, you ain't going to do that. You're not going to treat them that way. What they did was worthwhile and important, and they deserve the spoils as well. And so it became a part of what they followed from that day forward, that those who were in the army of Israel, regardless of what part they had, they shared equally in the spoil and equally in whatever blessing was given. But notice the foundation of that. Verse 23, you shall not do so with what the Lord has given us, who has preserved us and delivered into our hands the troop that came against us. And so David says, first of all, you didn't do this. You don't have a right to say, they don't deserve the spoils that I deserve, because you didn't do this. God did it. And that's the attitude that we need to recognize in anything we have and can accomplish. It's not us. It's God. David? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's probably the case, because he recognized what could happen if he did not take control of it. Yeah, that's probably it. And yes, yeah. What did Achan do? Yes, he took spoil that he was not supposed to take. Jericho was like a first fruit offering to God. Nothing was taken. No spoil was taken from the city of Jericho. Achan violated that and took something very valuable and hid it. It makes me wonder what person thinks they can get away with something like that. You know, when famous paintings are stolen or things like that are stolen. I was listening to Short History of podcast the other day about the crown jewels of England, and this guy had stolen some of them. I'm like, what are you going to do with that? You can't sell it. You know, you can't wear it. I mean, it's obvious what it is. And so, but anyway, people do that kind of thing. Achan did it, and David said, you're not doing it, because you're going to recognize that God has provided these things for us. There's a New Testament passage that says much the same in 1 Corinthians 4 and verse 7, where Paul says, in essence, what do you have that was not given to you by God? And the answer is there's nothing. Everything you have of value and of worth came from God. Well, I worked hard and I made my own way. No, you didn't. Well, yeah, what are you going to do with it once you get there? But
what are you going to do with it at the end of life?
yeah, exactly. Yeah. But you didn't do that of your own. Where'd you get that strength? Where'd you get that ability? Where'd you get that intelligence? ultimately, everything we have and everything we are is from God. And until we learn that, we're going to make the mistake of thinking, I don't need God, when there's nothing further from the truth. And so David said, you're not doing it because God has provided these things for us, and you're going to treat that appropriately, and it's going to be shared with all who are there. All right, any other thoughts? Tom?
You got up there, God's grace is decisive. I thought about when Paul pleaded with the Lord to take this thing from him, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm. The thorn in the flesh? Yeah.
And God and Jesus said that our grace is sufficient for you.
Yes.
Then he makes a statement. He says that my strength, my strength is made perfect in weakness.
Yes.
That there are so many people, their pride sends them to the ruin many times. But when they are cast into a different situation, whether they lose a leg, they're in a bad wreck, or they get real sick and they're weakened as a result of that, their attitude many times changes.
Mm-hmm.
And they look more toward God. And that may have been the only way that they would have ever done that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's God's grace that provides that. And David turned to God in that weakened condition. The next chapter, you'll see a man who did not. And it's a tragic end for Saul because of it. I mentioned also that David was going to do something with some of that spoil as well. At the end of the chapter, starting about verse 27, well, go back to verse 26. When they came back to Ziklag, he sent some of the spoil to the elders of Judah. And there's a number of cities listed there. Most of those in the area around Hebron, the southern part of Judah. And he sent to those city leaders some of the spoil. See, this was taken from the Amalekites. They had suffered at the hand of the Amalekites, and David returns that to them. This sows the seeds of the strength that he will need with these people, the connection he'll need with these people when he comes back into Judah as king of Israel. Because we're very close to the time when David will be recognized as king, because Saul is going to be killed in chapter 31. And so David not only finds his strength in God and refuses to let his men act in a way they should not, but he acts wisely. And he makes some connections with the rulers of the cities that's going to help him in the days that are ahead. But he recognizes all of that is a result of the grace of God. All right, and then the victory is encouraging. David and the people are back in Ziklag. They don't stay there long. They leave there, come back into Judah, but they are encouraged because of what God has provided. All right, now let's move on to the next chapter. It's a tragic end. I've got three words. I'm going to go ahead and put them up: tragedy, truth, and tenderness. Tragedy, because as chapter 31 opens, we kind of come into the battle as it's already raging, and it's not going well for Israel. In fact, verse 1 gives kind of the synopsis of all that takes place. The Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. And so Israel fled, and they fell. And in the fighting, the Philistines followed hard after Saul and his sons, and the sons of Saul were killed. Jonathan mentioned first. The archers hit Saul. He's severely wounded. And that's when he calls upon his armor bearer to draw his sword and kill him. But the armor bearer refuses to do so. Probably because of the fact this is God's anointed, I'm not going to raise my hand against him. And so Saul ends up falling on his own sword. And verse 6, Saul, his 3 sons, his armor bearer, and all his men died together that same day. Probably the phrase all his men is not referring to the entire army, but Saul's inner circle. Those closest to him were all killed that day. So think about the tragedy. The death of Jonathan is definitely a tragedy, is it not? I mean, Jonathan was as good a friend to David as David could have. Jonathan recognized the sin of his father and did not in any way countenance it. And yet here he is, faithful to his father, fighting side by side with his father, because that's what he's supposed to do. But I came across a statement this week in one of the sources I was looking at that raised this question. I thought it's probably as good a one as I've seen. Is it a tragedy to lay aside a kingdom that he could not have to enter a kingdom he could not lose? As a faithful person, Jonathan recognized, my father's kingdom will never come to me. It belongs to David. And he accepted that, he recognized that, he supported that. But by being faithful to God, at death he would enter into something he could not lose. Is that really a tragedy? And maybe we should say it's not a tragedy. That's a blessing. Sometimes the question is raised. Yes? Mm-hmm. 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 What did Paul say in Philippians chapter 1? To die and to be with Christ is far better. What did he tell the church in Thessalonica about their loved ones who had fallen asleep in Jesus? You can sorrow not as those who have no hope. Because, as you said, we're actually sorrowing for the fact that we are bereft of them, that we don't see them again here on this earth. But there's always that caveat, isn't there? It's not the last time we see them. Yes, yes. Right. Because we fail to see beyond the veil, beyond this life. Because in the minds of a lot of people, that's not real. That's not reality. That's just, fanciful thinking. But it is real. It's as real as anything can be. And that's the reason it's not a tragedy. And we can be thankful that we have that hope. And somebody like Jonathan recognizes that. And so what is indeed tragic in some ways is really not ultimately a tragedy. The word truth. God had said back in chapter 28? Back in chapter 28 when Saul went to the medium at Endor and she raised Samuel up. And through Samuel, God told Saul. In fact, Samuel put it this way. This is at verse number 19. Moreover, the Lord will also deliver Israel with you into the hand of the Philistines. And tomorrow, you and your sons will be with me. In other words, he said, you're going to die. Now, that's chapter 28, and Samuel says that will happen tomorrow. And so what we see in chapter 29, chapter 30, happen around the same time this is going on. But with Saul, this is the next day. He's fighting the Philistines. It doesn't go well. They pursue him. The archers mortally injure him. He takes his life. What God said was true. What God had said came to pass. And there's something about that should be comforting. Whether we are in darkness or light, to know that what God said is true is a comfort. Now, this is not a good thing for Saul. You're going to die. You and your sons will be dead this time tomorrow. But that God can be trusted is something that we can hold on to. This is a big book. And there are a lot of things that God said. And without fail, it all came to pass. God's promises are as sure as anything can be. And that gives us hope and gives us comfort. And then real quickly, so we don't lose it, the word tenderness. Right at the end of the chapter, right at the end of the book. The Philistines come back the next day to go through the battlefield to find anything of value. And they find Saul and his sons. They realize this is the king. They cut his head off. They mutilate him. They take his body and they nail it to a wall. I mean, these are barbaric things that they're doing, but it's like we are the victors, and here's evidence that we are victors. They take his armor, they send it back to the idol temple, the idol that they worship, in essence saying, our gods beat the gods of Israel. That's not true. They find out later that's not true, but that's what they're thinking. And so here's Saul and his sons, their bodies desecrated like that. So in verse 11, the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul. All the valiant men arose and traveled all night and took the body of Saul, the bodies of his sons, from the wall of Bethshan. They came to Jabesh and burned them there. Then they took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree at Jabesh and fasted 7 days. And so here are men that said, we're not going to let that stand. That's not right for our king to be treated that way. And they go recover the body and they give it a decent burial. They could not reverse what happened on Mount Gilboa. But there's something right about what they did. And there are other instances in the Bible where that's the case. Well, think of one where Jesus is on the cross and the women who had followed him are there. What can they do? They can't do anything, but they're there. And they follow Nicodemus and Joseph when they prepare the body of Jesus' burial, and they see it. And they see where they bury him. And they come back after the Sabbath to continue the burial. They can't do a lot, but they're there because they care about the one who died for them. And that's where we end chapter 31, the book of 1 Samuel. Next week, about one more week before our summer series, I want to come back and look at an overview of the book and then take just a few moments to kind of give us an idea of where we're going to go in the second Samuel. We come back in October, and what I want us to do is look at 2 Samuel beginning there and go through the book like we did 1 Samuel. So that's where we are. That's where we're going. I hope this lesson has been helpful to you tonight.
There it is. Texas Songbook be turning number 485. 485. Tom Earwood will lead that in just a few moments. At the close of our service tonight, Seth has our closing prayer. A couple that we want to mention on our sick list. Remember, this Friday, Lainey Light will be undergoing a heart cath to determine what they need to do as far as her condition. So be sure and keep her in your prayers as that is upcoming. Also, Regina's cousin's daughter-in-law underwent surgery Monday and Tuesday of last week. She came through the surgery okay. She is now back at home. If you remember, as a result of that surgery, she did lose hearing in one ear. It's going to be a lengthy recovery, but we're certainly thankful that she is that far along. If you'd like to send a card or something, if you'll just message Regina, she can give you an address. But please keep her in your prayers. Is there anyone else we need to add to our sick list tonight? All right, some things we have coming up. Remember, this Saturday, we will be putting together the homeless meals in the fellowship hall. We'll be moving that up an hour, so it will be meeting at 8:30. If you'd like to help come put those together, 8:30, and then we'll be taking them to Huntsville. If you'd like to go and help distribute that, just see Dale or see myself, and we'll make sure that you are part of that. Also, remember, Ruth's graduation party is going to be Saturday, 4 o'clock. So that also at the fellowship hall. Right after we dismiss tonight, Wyatt needs to meet with the young men who are going to be involved in the worship service on the 5th Sunday night. So if you're planning to do that, be sure and see Wyatt down front after we dismiss tonight. The song selected raises the question, what will you do with Jesus? As we were closing our study tonight here in the auditorium, we talked about something that the men of Jabesh Gilead did after the death of Saul that showed something about their character. I mentioned the women who followed Jesus throughout his ministry. Some of those women helped him, assisted him in his ministry. They gave him supplies. They gave him money at times. When Jesus was crucified, those women were there at the cross. They weren't able to do much, but they were there. When Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus took the body of Jesus down from the cross and prepared it for burial, the women were there. They saw that. They saw where the body of Jesus was laid. They saw the stone rolled into place. It appears, on the basis of what they were doing and the time of day and all of the things involved, that perhaps in their mind the body of Jesus was not fully prepared for burial because it had to be done hastily. And so they intended to return after the Sabbath. And they brought spices with them, and they were interested in rolling the stone away so that they could get to where the body was to put those spices there. Of course, when they got there, that wasn't necessary anymore. But there's something about what they were willing to do. Even though they could not stop what was happening on the cross, they were there. And even though ultimately they didn't get to finish the burial process, they were there, they were willing. There are a lot of things that God's people cannot do. There are a lot of things that sometimes I wish were possible. It's just not possible. There's one thing that God seeks from all of us, and that is that we are willing to be used as his servants. And when you are willing, and you have the attitude of those women who were there at the cross, God can use that and bring about great things and bring about glory to his name. The question, what will you do with Jesus, is one that everyone must consider personally. And the answer that we have, the answer that we give to that, will have a lot to do with how our life is lived and where our eternity is spent. As we sing this song tonight, as we give thought to that question, raise the question with yourself. Make the determination in your own heart. What am I doing with Jesus?